In this lesson, we are going to take a practice test on factoring. On this practice test, you will not be told which method to use when. The directions will be to simply factor. How do I know when to do what? This is the chart I've written down for you during every class. For step 1, you always have to find the greatest common factor and pull it out. And then step 2, you have to identify the number of terms to know which method to use. So 2 terms is either the sum or difference of squares or the sum or difference of cubes. 3 terms is the AC method, and 4 terms is grouping. You may want to write this chart down so you have that throughout the rest of this lesson because we will be referencing it. So on number 1, we're going to look at our chart to figure out what we need to do. So on number 1, I have x squared plus x minus 90. So how do I know when to do what? Step 1 says to take out the greatest common factor. Well, we have to look and see, do any of these 3 terms have something in common? The answer is no, there's nothing they have in common, so we jump to step 2. We identify the number of terms. There are 1, 2, 3 terms. So 3 terms tells us to use the AC method. Your AC method is when you identify your A, B, and C. Remember, the formula is ax squared plus bx plus c, where a is the number in front of the x squared, so in this case it's 1. B is the number in front of the x, which in this case is also a 1. And your c is the number by itself at the very end, the constant, which in this case it's a negative 90. And now you draw your flying x. So your x's go on top of your wings, that's the variable we're using. Your a times c goes up top here. So 1 times negative 90 is negative 90, and b is 1. So we need to find out what multiplies to give us negative 90 and adds to give us a positive 1. So I'm going to write out the factors of negative 90, and I know that I'm going to have one positive number and one negative number because the only way to get a negative product is by multiplying a positive and a negative together. So we have 1 times 90, 2 times 45, 3 times 30, 4 does not work, 8 does not, or 5 does work. 5 times 18, 6 goes into it 15 times, and then 9 and 10. So the pair that could give us a positive 1 would be a 9 and a 10, and we have to find out which one's positive and which one's negative. Your biggest number, when you have to choose which one's positive and negative, the biggest number will always be whatever sign your B is. So in this case, the 9 has to be negative, the 10 has to be positive. Then you write out your answer in your answer space to get x minus 9, and then x plus 10. Remember, factoring is when you multiply something times something else. So to check your answer, you could distribute this back out, and if you get what you started with, then you did it correct. Number 2, step 1 tells us to take out our greatest common factor. So our greatest common factor is going to be 5x squared yz. You've got to look and see what number do 15 and 25 have in common, which is 5. If you've got an x squared and an x to the third, the most x's you can take out are 2. Between the y and the y squared, the most you can take out is just y. And between the 2 z's, the most you can take out is z. So now you divide each of these terms by that 5x squared yz. 5 goes into 15 3 times. X squareds will cancel, your y's will cancel, and your z's will cancel. So it's just a 3 there. Then negative 25 divided by 5 is negative 5. You've got 3 x's take 2 away, so you're left with 1x. You've got 2 y's, you take 1 away, so you're left with 1 y. And you've got 1 z, and you take 1 z away, so you have no z's left. Be careful when you write your answer on your answer space that you copy it exactly the way that you wrote it, so you don't make any mistakes. So once we take out the greatest common factor, we need to look here and make sure that we couldn't go any further. Well, we can identify that there are 2 different terms here, and it would be the difference, but I don't have perfect squares or perfect cubes on each side. So that's how I knew that I couldn't go any further at this point. Number 3, step 1 is to take out my greatest common factor. Well, there is a greatest common factor, and it's 3. So I'm left with 5x squared minus 9x minus 2. So now I'll have to look inside of my set of parentheses, and I have 3 terms, so that means I'm going to use the AC method. So you do the AC method of what is inside those parentheses. A is 5, B is -9, C is -2. So my 5x goes up top. Remember, it's always whatever variable you're using and the A. Up here, we didn't have to do that on number 1 because your A was an understood 1, so we didn't have to write anything. So we need to find out, well, first off up here, 5 times -2 is -10, and then your B goes down here, which is -9. So we need to find out what multiplies to give us -10 and adds to give us a -9. Well, I know one number has to be positive and one number has to be negative in order for them to equal a -10. So I'm going to use the numbers 1 and 10. And remember, your biggest number takes whatever sign your B is. So since B is the negative, that means my 10 will be negative. Now, before I can write out my 2 binomials, I have to simplify my fractions. The 5 and 1 don't simplify here, but this 5 and 10 simplifies to be a 1 and a 2. So that would make these binomials 5x plus 1, because of here, and then x minus 2. But that's not my final answer. I took out this 3 here. So I would have to write that 3 in front of my answer. I have to do that if I want to get the answer right. Because remember, these have to multiply back out to give me this answer. If you did not include the 3, it would have only multiplied out to give you this answer, which wasn't what we started with. Number 4. Well, we can look at number 4 and say this is a grouping problem because there are 4 terms. So grouping is when you take the greatest common factor 3 times. So you take the greatest common factor out of this first. So I can take out a 4v squared, which leaves me with 7v plus 4. And then up here I can take out a -3, which would give me 7v plus 4, because I would have divided each of these terms by a -3. And the reason I did that is you've got to look and say, okay, what is the greatest common factor here? Remember, you can't have a negative for this first term, so that's why we had to take out a negative. So this is your checkpoint. Do I have the same thing in each set of parentheses? The answer is yes. So I pull out that 7v plus 4, which leaves me with 4v squared minus 3. Now number 5, step 1 is to take out the greatest common factor. We notice there is not anything that these 2 terms have in common. So we're going to move on to step 2 and identify the number of terms. There are 2 terms, and it is the sum means plus, of squares, and that 2 tells me it's of squares. If you remember our lesson on the sum of squares, all of the sum of squares are prime. That means we cannot break them apart to be anything times something else. So number 6, this one is a little bit different because as opposed to having the sum being addition that we had before, this is now the difference because it's subtraction. That's the difference between those two. And I've got perfect squares on either side. So that means this is the car method. So I have to draw my two cars. One's a happy car, one's a sad car. One's the car you want to be in, one's the car you don't want to be in. So the front seat and the back seat. So what times itself gives you 4a squared? The answer is 2a. And then what times itself gives you 81? The answer is 9. So you should have 2a plus 9, 2a minus 9. And it doesn't matter if you wrote the minus in the first car or the second car. It really doesn't matter as long as you have 1 plus and 1 minus. Number 7, step 1 is to take out the greatest common factor. Since there isn't one, we're going to go to step 2 and identify the number of terms. So there are 3 terms here. So we're going to use the AC method. We're going to identify our A, B, and C. I get a 5x on top. A times C goes up here. So 5 times -3 is -15. And then your B goes down here and it's a -14. So I need to find out what multiplies to give me -15 and adds to give me a -14. I know I need one positive number and one negative number. I'm going to use 1 and 15. And remember, your biggest number takes the sign of your B. So since your B is negative, your biggest number is going to be negative. Now I'm going to simplify my fractions. So 5 and 15 simplifies to be 1 and 3. That 5 and 1 doesn't simplify, so we leave that alone. So I'm left with 5x plus 1 and then x minus 3. Number 8, step 1 is to factor out the greatest common factor. So we have to look and see what do these terms have in common. They have a -4x in common. Remember, you have to take out a -4 because you can't have that first term to be negative. So I'm going to take out a -4x, which leaves me with x minus 2. The reason it's x minus 2 is because 8 divided by -4 is a -2. And then we look and see, can we do anything to these two terms here? It's the difference, but it's not of squares or cubes, so there's nothing else we can do here. So now number 9. Step 1, is there a greatest common factor? There isn't one. So step 2, we need to identify the number of terms. We have 2 terms, and there is that 3 on the exponent that tells us it's the cubes. It's a difference of cubes, which is our car bus problem. So you always draw your car and then your bigger bus, and then you wash it with that soap. It's the same, opposite, always positive. So if I start off with a negative, then I'm going to have a negative here because it would be the same sign. Opposite of a negative would be a positive. And then this last one is always positive. Then I do cube root, cube root. So what times itself 3 times gives me x to the 3rd? The answer is x. What times itself 3 times gives me 125? The answer is 5. Then square, multiply, square. So I square this first term. So x squared is x squared. Multiply these two together to get a 5x. Square this last term to get 5 squared is 25. And that's it. Number 10. Step 1 is to take out your greatest common factor. So my greatest common factor is 2. So that gives me x squared minus 4x minus 21. So you divide each of these terms by that 2. Now you know 2 is going to be in your answer, so go ahead and write it on your answer space. Then you identify the number of terms inside of your set of parentheses. There are 3 terms, so that means that we're going to use our AC method. So we have A, B, C. So my A is 1, B is -4, C is -21. I need to set up my X. So A times C goes up top, and B goes down at the bottom. And I need to find out what multiplies to give me -21 and adds to give me a -4. So I know one number has to be positive and one number has to be negative. Well, I'm going to use 3 and 7. And my 7 is going to be negative because your higher number is going to take whatever sign your B is. So since B was a negative, the bigger number is negative. So I have x plus 3 and x minus 7. All right, number 11. Step 1 is to take out your greatest common factor. Since we don't have one, we have to identify the number of terms, which there are 2. You have 2 terms. It's the sum of cubes because of that 3 right there. So that means it's another car bus problem. So same, opposite, always positive. So since we started out with a plus, we're going to have a plus here for the same. Opposite of a plus would be a minus, and then this one is always positive. So what times itself 3 times gives me x to the 3rd? The answer is x. What times itself 3 times gives me 1? The answer is 1. So then you square, multiply, square. X squared gives me x squared. Multiply these 2 together to get an x in the middle. And then you square this last term. 1 squared is 1. And we are finished. Number 12 is our AC method. We know that because we can't take out a greatest common factor because there's nothing they have in common. And there are 3 terms. My x's go on top of my wings, my -7 goes up top here, and my b goes down here. So I need to find out what multiplies to give me 7 and adds to give me 3. Multiplies to give me -7, sorry, and adds to give me 3. Well, 7 is a prime number, so there's only 2 numbers that work. 1 times 7. And there's no way we can either add or subtract these to get a 3. So that tells us this does not work, which means it is prime. Okay. Number 13 is a grouping problem because you have 1, 2, 3, 4 terms. You underline your first 2 terms, and then you underline your second 2 terms. So I take out a 3x in the first 2 terms, which leaves me with 7y plus 5. And then I take out a 5r in the second 2 terms, which leaves me with 7y plus 5. Check and make sure you have the same in each parentheses. Since we do, we take out that greatest common factor of 7y plus 5. And then we're left with 3x plus 5r. Number 14. Okay, number 14, step 1 is to see is there a greatest common factor. So I have a negative x squared, a 7x, and a -18. Well, there's no number that they have in common, but we can take out a -1 because you never want that leading coefficient to be negative. So when I pull out that -1, I'm left with x squared minus 7x, because 7x divided by -1 is -7x. -18 divided by -1 is a +18. Now I look inside and say, well, how many terms are there? There are 3. So we've got A, B, C. A is 1, B is -7, C is 18. So I have to find what numbers multiply to give me 18 and add to give me -7. Well, you may choose 2 and 9, but in order for this to give us a +18, they either both have to be positive or they both have to be negative. Well, if they're both positive, 2 plus 9 is 11. If they're both negative, -2 plus -9 is -11. So there's no way that we can have two numbers that multiply to give us 18 and add to give us -7. So that means this right here would be our answer. And the reason is because there was a greatest common factor. That's why it's not prime. Number 15. Step 1 is to take out the greatest common factor. Since there isn't one, I'm going to identify my number of terms. There are 2 terms, and I have the difference of cubes. So that's my car bus method. So it's same, opposite, always positive. So we start off with a negative, so we use the same as that we started off with. Opposite would be plus, and then always positive. So it's cube root, cube root. What times itself 3 times gives me x to the 3rd? Answer is x. What times itself 3 times gives me 27? The answer is 3. So then you square, multiply, square. So x squared gives me x squared. X times 3 is 3x. 3 squared is 9. Last page. Number 16. Step 1 is to identify the greatest common factor. There isn't one. So step 2 is to identify the number of terms. There are 2 terms, and it is the difference of 2 perfect squares. So that is my car method. On your car method, you always have a good car and a bad car, and a front seat and a back seat. So x squared, what times itself gives me x squared? The answer is x. And since the x squared was in my front seat, my x's go in the front seats of my car. And then what times itself gives me 36? The answer is 6. And so now I'm finished with that problem. Number 17 is a grouping problem because there are 4 terms. So I underline my first 2 terms and then my second 2 terms. So on the first 2 terms, I can pull out a y, which leaves me with 3x minus y. In these second 2 terms, there's nothing that they have in common, but in grouping, you have to pull something out. So we're going to pull out a 1. So that would still leave me with the 3x minus y on the inside. Now we have the same in both of our sets of parentheses. So I'm going to pull out a 3x minus y here. And then I have my y plus 1 left over. Number 18, I first need to look and see if I have a greatest common factor. There isn't one, so then I identify my number of terms. So I have 3 terms, so that means the AC method. So my x's go on top. A times c is 12, b is 7. So I need to find out what multiplies to give me 12 and adds to give me 7. Well, the numbers I'm going to use are 3 and 4. And so I have x plus 3 and x plus 4. So now on number 19, step 1 is to take out my greatest common factor. My greatest common factor is a 2. When I pull that 2 out, I'm left with x squared minus 16. Then I look inside of my parentheses and see if we can factor that. Well, it's 2 terms, and it's the difference of squares. So in your difference of squares, that's your car method. Don't forget that 2 is a part of your answer. So you can't just drop it, you've got to put it in your answer. If you don't, it's wrong. So you always have a good car and a bad car. What times itself gives you x squared? The answer is x. And then 1 times itself gives you 16. The answer is 4. And so now we are finished. So we have 2 times x plus 4, x minus 4. And then finally we have the last problem, which is number 20. Step 1, is there a greatest common factor? The answer is no. So then you identify the number of terms. I have 3 terms, so that's my AC method. I'm going to set these up in my x. So my x goes up top. A times c is negative 72. B is negative 1. So I need to find out what multiplies to give me negative 72 and adds to give me negative 1. So I'm going to use 8 and 9. And remember, when you have to choose which one is positive and which one is negative, your biggest number will always take whatever sign your b is. So since my b is negative, my bigger number of 9 will be negative. So my answer is x plus 8, x minus 9. And that's the end of this practice test. I hope that this video has helped you. Remember, your test will be very similar to this one. There will just be different problems on there. You will still have 5 problems per page. You will have 20 problems all together. All right, I wish you the best of luck.